Hey, how's it going? So, like I mentioned last week, we've been moving into a new apartment. We are finally here in the new apartment. I'm sure it doesn't look that much different on video, but yeah, it's a cool new place. Still in the North Dallas area, so not too far of a move. I haven't really had that much time to work on the game recently, just because a lot of my time has been taken up with moving and with contract work, which isn't really flexible. So the stuff that ends up falling off the table most of the time ends up being actual game development. But I did have some really cool ideas the other day for how I'm planning to implement some of the procedural narrative stuff in Gunmetal Arcadia. I have a clearer picture of where that's going to go. I thought that might be fun to talk about in this week's video. So going back to the very beginning of Gunmetal Arcadia, one of the fundamental promises of that game has been the idea that it's a roguelike, random levels, permadeath, something that you'll be playing over and over again. But I wanted to not have the frustration of oh, I died and I lost all my progress and now I'm back to square one, and yeah, okay, maybe I learned something, but still, sometimes I play roguelike games and I end up feeling frustrated, I wish there were something that I could actually earn just by investing time in the game. But I didn't want to go in the direction of having a system of unlocks where you feel like you can't really be viable until you've spent enough time to unlock everything. I think that has its own set of frustrations. And where I kind of landed was this idea that every time you play through the game, regardless of whether you win or lose, things that you do will have some consequence on future sessions. Those might be good things, they might be bad things, but fundamentally I want the player to feel like every time they play the game, something meaningful is happening as a result of that play session. The way that I had been envisioning this for months and months now was basically to have so I need to back up a second and talk first about, there are going to be the two factions in the game, the Gunmetal Vanguard and the Seekers of Arcadia, and you can choose to be aligned with one of them or neither of them. And so the narrative is going to largely revolve around the struggle between those two factions and how they react in the face of an invading army. So the way that I've been thinking about doing the procedural narrative is to basically have the player's relationship with both of these factions changing depending on things they do. And I was imagining that the implementation would be sort of a series of sliders. How much does each faction like the player? How powerful is each faction? These sorts of things. So maybe if you choose to align yourself with the Gunmetal Vanguard, that they like you more. Maybe if you win the game while you are aligned with them, they become more powerful, and maybe that allows them to sell you items at a discount. Maybe it unlocks some newer, better weapons the next time you play. But fundamentally, I was imagining that this would be sort of a series of sliders under the hood where actions would shift values one way or the other. And I never really liked the idea. It was just the first thing that came to mind when I was imagining how this would work. And so last week I just kind of had the idea that why don't I just boil everything down to very clearly defined cause and effect, action-reaction pairs. So rather than saying, okay, this faction likes you by X amount, and oh, now you've hit that threshold that they unlock new things, why don't I just say, okay, because you did X, Y happens. Because you joined the Seekers of Arcadia, the next time you play, some new technology will be available to you. That sort of thing. Where it's very very clearly defined. It would be easier to put the information into a wiki, for instance, rather than saying, okay, there are some hidden numbers under the hood, and you kind of have to guess at what's happening based on the way you're playing. So I realize I'm kind of rambling here, but basically, yeah, the idea was to move away from sort of hidden information and move in the direction of clearly defined actions and reactions. It makes more sense from from my perspective as a developer, because I don't have to worry about, how do I tune those numbers? How do I set a threshold for the slider has moved far enough in this direction that something should happen in response to that? And I think from the player's perspective, it's going to be less to think about as far as like, oh, several sessions ago I sold an item to someone and maybe that changed his opinion of me, and now do I need to be thinking about how that's going to affect my next session? And that's not what this game is. It's fundamentally like, yes, it's a roguelite or roguelike, whatever. And I want there to be some of these, role-playing or narrative elements, but fundamentally it's an action-adventure platformer game, and you shouldn't have to be thinking about that sort of hidden information while you're playing the game. So I think that experience is going to be better. And two, it's allowed me to focus the scope of what sort of actions or reactions will occur, basically to condense that scope down to, what did you do in the previous game and how does that affect your current session? What are you doing in the current session and how will that affect your next session? That's the entire scope of what you need to keep in mind at once. You don't have to worry about what did I do like 5 sessions ago. And that's not to say that there might not be for instance, a chain of unlocks. Like, I did something last session that has now unlocked something for this run, and if I take advantage of that, that will allow something to happen next time. There could be those sorts of sequences of actions that could occur over time, but it's not going to be just a clunky mess of hidden information. I guess from there I started thinking about like what the ending of the game is going to be, and some of this might be a little bit spoilerish, but it's a roguelike. It's supposed to be played over and over, so I don't think there's too much concern about spoiling the ending of a game like that. Essentially, at the end of the game, you will defeat the final boss, and you'll get some MacGuffin that you can decide what you want to do with. You can either give it to one of the 2 factions, you can keep it for yourself, or you can destroy it. And depending on what you do then, different things will happen the next time you play, and each of these decisions will have some benefits and some consequences. If you give the MacGuffin to one of the factions, they become more powerful, but they also become a little bit more evil, and you might end up fighting someone from that faction as the true final boss the next time you play. If you keep the thing for yourself, maybe you become more evil, and either you end up fighting your doppelganger at the end as the true final boss, or maybe I'm not exactly sure how that would go, but essentially my idea is that based on each of these 4 decisions, there will be 4 different true final bosses after the fake first final boss. So to get all the achievements, to get every possible outcome, you would have to go through each of those sequences of events at least once. At any time, you can also just basically reset everything to 0, basically go back to a completely vanilla playthrough as if it were your first time playing. There will be some item that lets you do that. In my head, I've been calling it the Vanilla Bean, which I think is a super clever name, and I'm super happy I came up with it. So one of the questions that sort of raised once I started thinking about like how the ending of the game would work is what sort of effects will that have on daily challenges? Because daily challenges are definitely something I want to do with Gunmetal Arcadia, but I was imagining those would always start from 0, start from a vanilla playthrough themselves. And if that were the case, then I was thinking, okay, so then you get to the end, you get to the sort of fake first final boss, and that's it. That's always the end of the daily challenge. So I was trying to think, how could I find ways to still allow there to be that end game content as part of the daily challenges? And I had a few ideas. I guess the first idea is you don't do anything. That content just doesn't exist in the dailies at all. The second idea would be to allow the player to carry over whatever sort of state their ordinary campaign were in into the daily challenges, have that overlap. The problem then is like it sort of defeats the purpose of having daily challenges as like something that levels the playing field. You want every player to be going into those with exactly the same experience. And if you allow players to carry over the state of their own campaign, you lose that benefit. Another idea I had would be to essentially allow daily challenges to exist across more than a single session. So you play through one run and you reach the final boss and you kill it, and then it just goes into another preceded run. So again, you know, if two players were playing the same game, they would both reach the end of the game, kill the final boss, and start a new run, and they would have the same experience there. Except then, you know, whatever decisions they had made would shape that second run, and conceivably third and fourth runs, and however long these went on. I don't know then at that point how long is each session going to be. Are we talking about daily challenges that could last for hours? Like, I don't necessarily think that's that's going to be the right solution, but it's a possible option. And then I guess the other idea I had would just be to randomize those initial conditions. So like at the start of a daily challenge, it basically would say, regardless of what your current campaign is, we're going to just provide some default narrative state. So things just are a certain way. So then you get the benefit of everyone's on the same level playing field, but you lose the player choice. Like, you aren't making the decisions that drive that. It's just, well, here's some content that, you know, all players are going to see the same thing. So there's a few different options there for how I might want to deal with daily challenges in the context of procedural narrative elements. I don't necessarily think that one of them stands out as the best one, but, you know, obviously I do want to preserve player choice if possible, and I do think it's necessary to make sure that all players start with equal footing for the daily challenges. So any solution would have to maintain those things. But yeah, that's sort of what I've been thinking about this week, and hopefully by next week, you know, I'll have my home office set up a little bit better, have some of these boxes moved out of the way, and hopefully I have actually had some time to do some development on the game. So that's unfortunately the thing that tends to fall off the table, because, you know, contract work is not really flexible. You know, I have to maintain a schedule for the development blogs and for these videos. Of course, when I have, you know, real life obligations like moving, that sort of trumps everything else. And usually game development is the one thing that falls away. So hopefully this week I will have some time to actually do some development. Probably ought to be doing more work on Gunmetal Arcadia 0, doing some new enemy designs and that sort of thing. But if you're enjoying this series, if you're enjoying this video series or my development blogs, please consider donating to my Patreon. As always, you can send me feedback on Twitter or on Ask.fm. My username is Pirate Hearts in both of those. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.